Picture this. It is the night of June the 15th, 1826, and the most feared infantry force the world has ever known is being blown to pieces inside the walls of its own home. The barracks in the heart of Constantinople are packed with soldiers whose ancestors made kings tremble from Vienna to Baghdad, and rolling into position in the square outside, wheel by iron wheel, are the great bronze cannons of the Ottoman Sultan. There is a pause, a held breath across the whole city. Then the order comes down the line and the guns open up. Grape shot, hundreds of iron balls per blast, rips through timber and flesh at once. The wooden barracks catch fire. Men who spent their lives as the terror of 3 continents are trapped, burning, screaming, clawing at doors that will not open. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. The man who gave that order was not a foreign invader. He was not a rival empire. He was their own sultan, the single human being on earth these soldiers had sworn on their lives to protect. Honestly, this is one of the strangest acts of self-mutilation in military history. We usually picture the Janissaries as the unstoppable spearhead of the Ottoman war machine, the elite of the elite, the reason Europe spent centuries terrified of the crescent flag. Hollywood and the textbooks give you noble warriors in white caps marching to a booming military band. But the brutal reality is that on this night they were being exterminated like an infestation by the very dynasty they were built to serve. The court chronicler Mehmed Ezad Effendi, the empire's official historian, wrote the earliest full account of that day in a book he titled Usi Zafer, The Foundation of Victory. Victory. That is what the state called the massacre of its own army. So the question that hangs over everything you're about to hear is simple and disturbing. What drives a ruler to calculate, coldly, deliberately, over 18 patient years, that the only way to save his empire is to annihilate the very weapon that built it? Before we dive into this forgotten story of survival, betrayal, and ice-cold calculation, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths that history books smooth over, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. There is something genuinely incredible about all of us gathering around these ancient stories from every corner of the planet, connected across time by nothing more than our shared hunger to know what really happened. Now, let us go back to the beginning, because to understand why the Sultan slaughtered his own army, you first have to understand how that army became a monster he could no longer control. The Janissaries did not begin as a threat. They began as an idea so ruthless it was almost brilliant. Put yourself in the boots of an early Ottoman sultan 600 years ago. You do not trust your own noble families. They have their own lands, their own ambitions, their own claims to the throne. So where do you get soldiers who will be loyal only to you? The answer the Ottomans landed on was the devshirme, the child levy, a system so cold it makes your skin crawl. Every few years, imperial officials would ride into the Christian villages of the Balkans and take the boys, not criminals, not volunteers, healthy, promising sons, torn from their mothers, converted to Islam, and raised as property of the Sultan. Imagine, for a second, a government van pulling up to your street today and driving off with the strongest, sharpest 10-year-olds, and you never see them as your children again. That was the deal. That was the blood tax. But here is the twist that made it work. These stolen boys were not thrown away. They were invested in, heavily. Think of it as the most extreme talent acquisition program ever run by a state. The most capable rose into the administration, some becoming governors and grand viziers, effectively running the empire. The rest were drilled into the Janissary Corps, the world's first modern standing professional army at a time when Europe still fought its wars with unreliable feudal levies who went home at harvest. While a French king had to beg his nobles for troops, the Ottoman Sultan had a permanent, salaried, superbly trained force that answered to him and him alone. They were paid in cash. They were fed from great communal cauldrons that became the sacred heart of each unit, and they were devastatingly good. For roughly 200 years, the Janissaries were the shock troops of Ottoman expansion, the men who stormed the walls of Constantinople in 1453 and ended the Roman Empire, the men who nearly took Vienna and made all of Christendom shudder. And then, slowly, the machine began to rot from the inside. This is the part nobody tells you. The Janissaries figured out something every powerful institution eventually figures out, that the real prize is not serving power, but becoming it. Let us look at the raw numbers, because they are staggering. Around the year 1575, at their sharpest, The corps numbered roughly 20,000 elite soldiers. By 1826, that number had ballooned to about 135,000. But, and this is everything, most of those men were not soldiers at all. Over the centuries, they had won the right to marry, to have children, to pass their membership down to their sons, and to run businesses on the side. So by the 19th century, the elite army was mostly a vast guild of shopkeepers, bakers, and craftsmen who happened to be on the imperial payroll drew a salary for military service they never performed, and paid no taxes while everyone else did. Imagine a corporation where the founding department stopped doing any actual work generations ago, but still cashed enormous paychecks, couldn't be fired, and had seized the power to fire the CEO instead. By some estimates, their pensions and pay were devouring up to 40% of the entire imperial budget. 40%, bleeding the treasury dry to fund an army that no longer fought. Because that was the other thing they had become, kingmakers. When they wanted a sultan gone, they had a ritual, and it was terrifying in its simplicity. They would gather in their great square and turn over their cooking cauldrons, those same sacred kettles they were fed from. An overturned cauldron meant one thing, revolt. And when the Janissaries revolted, sultans died. Any ruler who dared threaten their pay, their privileges, or their power tended to end up deposed, imprisoned, or strangled with a silk cord in a palace corridor. So picture the trap the throne was in. The empire was falling behind Europe, desperate for modern reform, but the one force strong enough to defend the empire was also the one force blocking every attempt to modernize it, and murdering anyone who tried. And there was one young prince growing up inside that palace who was about to watch exactly how deadly these men could be, because he very nearly died at their hands. His name was Mahmud, and to understand him you have to understand the horror he survived as a young man. His cousin was Sultan Selim III, a genuine reformer, a man haunted by the empire's decline who understood that the old ways were killing them. Selim tried to build a new, modern, European-style army, trained with muskets and discipline, a program called the Nizam-e-Jadid, the New Order. It was exactly what the empire needed, and it was exactly what got him killed. The Janissaries saw a modern army as a death sentence for their own privileges, a rival that would make them obsolete. So in 1807 they rose up, overthrew Selim, and threw him in the palace as a prisoner. His reforms were torn down overnight. His new soldiers were hunted and slaughtered. But it gets darker. In 1808, a provincial warlord named Alemdar Mustafa Pasha marched on the capital with an army to rescue Selim and restore the reforms. And the reigning puppet Sultan, Mustafa IV, made a monstrous calculation. He realized that if he was the only surviving adult male of the 600-year-old House of Osman, no one could replace him. So he ordered the murder of both remaining rivals, the deposed Selim and the young Prince Mahmud. Put yourself in Mahmud's shoes for 1 second. You're in your early 20s. Assassins are moving through the torchlit corridors of the palace with orders to kill you, right now, tonight, so that your own half-brother can be the last man of your bloodline standing. Selim was caught. He fought. He was stabbed and strangled, and his body was dragged out and shown to the rebels as proof that the reformer would reform no more. Mahmud should have died in the same hour. According to the accounts that survive, what saved him was almost accidental. A palace servant, a young woman remembered as Kevri, flung a handful of hot ashes into the faces of the onrushing assassins, blinding them just long enough. In that gap of a few seconds, Mahmud escaped. Out a window, up onto the roof of the harem, hauled to safety by loyal hands. Minutes later, Alemdar's troops broke into the palace, found Selim's corpse, and realized their reformer was dead. So they turned to the only reform-minded prince left alive, the boy on the roof, and made him Sultan, Mahmud II. He took the throne of the most powerful Islamic empire on earth, having just watched his cousin murdered, and having survived his own assassination by the width of a thrown handful of ash. And he took it knowing precisely who held the real power in his capital. The men in the white caps. The men who had killed Selim for the crime of trying to modernize. The men who now, technically, served him. Honestly, think about the psychology of that. Most people who survive something like that spend the rest of their lives afraid. Mahmud did something far more dangerous. He got patient. Because within months of his coronation, he received his final unforgettable lesson. Alemdar Mustafa Pasha, the very warlord who had made him sultan, tried to push reforms again. The Janissaries rose up once more, cornered Alamdar in a stone tower, and in his last act he reportedly blew up his own gunpowder store, taking dozens of his attackers with him into the blast. Mahmud's most powerful ally, the man who put the crown on his head, dead within a year, the message could not have been clearer. Move against the Janissaries before you are ready, and you will end up like Selim, a corpse dragged across a courtyard. And so the young Sultan made a decision that would define the next 18 years of his life. He would smile, he would wait, and he would build. This is where Mahmud reveals himself as one of history's great cold strategists, because what he did next was pure, patient, corporate-style manoeuvring, the kind of long game that would make a modern hostile takeover artist nod in respect. He learned the one lesson Selim never did: never make your move until the outcome is no longer in doubt. So for nearly 2 decades, Mahmud played the cautious, pious, unthreatening sultan. He did not attack the Janissaries. He starved them of oxygen instead. Think of it like a chief executive who inherits a company run by a corrupt, entrenched founding partner he cannot legally fire. What does he do? He spends years quietly stacking the board with his own people. He wins over the shareholders. He builds a loyal division that answers only to him. And he waits for the founding partner to make one fatal mistake. Mahmud packed the religious establishment, the ulema, the scholars whose word carried the weight of God in the eyes of ordinary Muslims, with men loyal to the throne. That was crucial because in the Ottoman world you could not simply massacre soldiers who wore the badge of holy warriors. You needed religious authority to declare it righteous. He cultivated commanders in the artillery and the cavalry, the units that had always resented the arrogant Janissaries, and he made sure the guns of the capital were in the hands of men who owed everything to him. He tightened his grip on the money and the bureaucracy, and all the while he endured humiliation, because these were brutal years for the empire. Between his coronation and 1826, Mahmud's forces fought the Russians, the Persians, and rebellion after rebellion. Serbs rising in the Balkans, and above all the Greeks, whose war for independence exploded in 1821 and dragged on, bloody and unwinnable. And in campaign after campaign, the Janissaries proved what everyone already knew. They would not fight, or they could not. The most feared army in Europe had become a paper tiger that lost battles, drained the treasury, and still held a knife to the throne's throat. Every defeat was another argument Mahmud filed away. Every humiliation was another brick in the case he was quietly building. By 1826, he had his loyal artillery, his loyal clergy, his loyal cavalry, and 18 years of patience. All he needed now was for the Janissaries to do the one thing they always did: revolt. So he decided to hand them the perfect excuse, on purpose. In the spring of 1826, Mahmud announced the creation of a new corps of European-drilled soldiers, the Eshkinchi, troops trained in the modern way, with muskets and discipline and foreign-style tactics. On the surface it looked like a modest reform. Underneath, it was bait. Mahmud knew exactly what would happen. He knew the Janissaries would see a modern army as the same existential threat that had made them murder Selim. He was counting on it. And right on cue, in the middle of June, the cauldrons went over. In the great square, the Janissaries gathered and overturned their sacred kettles, the ancient signal that the throne was once again in their crosshairs. They surged into the streets of the capital, confident, arrogant, doing what they had done for centuries, assuming that this sultan, like the others, would fold, dismiss his reforms, and hand over the officials they demanded. But this time the sultan did not fold. This time everything was already in place. Mahmud did something no cornered ruler before him had dared. He reached for the single most powerful object in the Islamic world, the Sankaka Sharif, the sacred banner of the Prophet Muhammad himself, unfurled only in moments of holy war. And in one stroke he transformed the entire meaning of the conflict. This was no longer a squabble between a sultan and his troops. By raising that banner, Mahmud declared that the Janissaries were now rebels against the faith itself, and he called upon every loyal Muslim in Constantinople to rally to the flag against them. His hand-picked clergy issued the religious ruling that made it righteous. His loyal artillery commanders moved their guns into position. His cavalry, the Sipahis, swept into the streets and did what the Janissaries never expected. They fought back, hard, and drove the mutineers backward, block by block, herding them out of the open city and into the one place that would become their tomb, their own barracks. Picture it from inside those walls. The confidence curdling into confusion, then into dawning horror, as the men who had ruled the empire for centuries realized they were not the hunters tonight. They were the trapped, and outside the great bronze cannons were already rolling into the square. What happened next is the moment the whole story has been driving toward, the 3-second decision that no other sultan had been willing to make. Mahmud gave the order to fire on his own army, and the guns did not stop. Grapeshot tore into the packed wooden barracks. The buildings were set ablaze by the bombardment, and the fire did what the iron did not. Let us look at the raw numbers, because they are almost impossible to sit with. Even the most conservative estimates put the dead in that single day at 4,000 to 6,000 men, with some accounts running far higher. And the killing did not end at the barracks. Janissaries who fled were run down in the streets by cavalry and by ordinary citizens. The same population that had suffered their extortion and arrogance for generations now unleashed. Some tried to hide in the ancient underground cisterns beneath the city and drowned in the dark. Others were dragged out and executed. Across the empire, in provincial garrisons far from the capital, the order went out and local populations turned on their own Janissaries, and thousands more died in the days and weeks that followed. Sit with the sheer scale of what Mahmud had just done. In a matter of hours, he had deliberately, systematically destroyed the institution that had conquered Constantinople, that had made the Ottoman Empire the nightmare of Europe for 400 years, that had planted the crescent at the gates of Vienna. He did not lose this army in a foreign war. He did not have it worn down by a rival power. He turned his own cannons on it and burned it out of existence, root and branch. The most feared soldiers on the continent, reduced to smoke wreathing over the rooftops of their own city. And by the time the fires died down, the core that had made and unmade sultans for centuries simply did not exist anymore. 600 years of history ended in an afternoon of grapeshot and flame, on the direct command of the one man they were created to obey. The state moved fast to bury them completely. Mahmud issued a decree formally abolishing the Janissary corps forever. He went further than mere dissolution. He ordered that their name be erased, banned from official use. He had their sacred regimental cauldrons, the very symbol of their brotherhood and their power to revolt, destroyed. He even moved against the Bektashi dervish order, the Sufi brotherhood spiritually intertwined with the Janissaries, suppressing it and seizing its properties. This was not just killing an army. This was the deliberate deletion of an institution, an attempt to scrub it from the memory of the empire, and in its place Mahmud raised something new, a modern European-style army he named the Asakiri Mansoure-i Muhammadiyeh, the victorious soldiers of Muhammad. The reform that had cost Selim his life, that Mahmud had waited 18 patient years to attempt, was finally, brutally, possible. The state called the whole bloody affair the Vakar-i-Hayriye, the auspicious incident, the fortunate event. That was the official verdict, that the slaughter had been a blessing. But here is the bitter irony that the triumphant name tries to hide, and it is the part that keeps this from being a simple story of a reformer winning. Because Mahmud had just gutted his own military at the worst conceivable moment. Think about the timing, like a gambler going all in with enemies at the table. He destroyed his army in 1826, and the empire's greatest threats were about to come knocking. Within a year, in 1827, a combined European fleet annihilated the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Navarino, helping to seal Greek independence. And in 1828, the Russian Empire, the empire's oldest and most dangerous rival, declared war and invaded. The Russo-Turkish War of 1828 to 1829 fell on an Ottoman military that was, in that moment, half rebuilt, inexperienced, its centuries-old professional corps reduced to ash the year before. Russian armies pushed across the Balkan mountains and reached Adrianople, terrifyingly close to Constantinople itself, forcing a humiliating peace. Even before that, the empire had been strong-armed into damaging concessions to Russia. Mahmud had removed the tumour, but in cutting it out he had left the patient defenceless on the operating table just as the wolves came in. So how do you weigh a decision like that? On one side, Mahmud broke the stranglehold that had strangled every attempt at reform for a century and killed his own cousin. He made the Tanzimat, the sweeping 19th century modernisation of the Ottoman army, law and government, finally possible. Later generations would argue the empire survived into the 20th century precisely because he had the nerve to do what no one else would. On the other side, he did it by butchering thousands of his own subjects and stripping the empire naked at the exact moment it needed defending, contributing to losses it never fully recovered from. Was it the salvation of the empire or the reckless gamble of a traumatized man finally taking his revenge? And that is really the heart of who Mahmud II was. Not a cartoon tyrant who killed for pleasure, and not a shining hero of progress. He was something more unsettling and more human than either. He was a survivor. A man who, as a young prince, watched his cousin murdered and escaped his own assassins by the width of a handful of thrown ash, and who then spent 18 years doing the coldest arithmetic imaginable. He looked at the army that built his empire and had nearly ended his own life, and he calculated that it could not be reformed, only destroyed, and that the price of destroying it, thousands dead and the empire briefly defenceless, was worth paying to keep his throne and drag his world into the modern age. He waited until he could not lose, and then he pulled the trigger on the most feared soldiers in the world. Go back to that night we started with. The cannons in the square, the barracks in flames, the Sultan who gave the order to slaughter the very men sworn to protect him. Now you know it was not madness. It was the endgame of a plan 2 decades in the making, born on the night a young man survived a murder he was never supposed to walk away from. So I leave you with this. Put yourself on that throne for a moment, with everything Mahmud knew. You know these men will eventually depose you or strangle you the way they did your cousin. It is only a matter of time. You know they are bleeding your treasury dry and losing every war. But you also know that if you destroy them, you will leave your empire without an army just as Russia sharpens its knife. You have the loyal guns in position and the sacred banner in your hand. The cauldrons have gone over, the choice is yours, and it will define everything that comes after. Knowing every single thing you now know, the survival, the cost, the terrible timing, would you have given the order to fire on your own army? Let me know your honest answer down in the comments. I read them, and this is exactly the kind of impossible decision I love hearing you wrestle with. And if you appreciated uncovering the brutal reality behind the legend, hit subscribe. There is another historical deep dive waiting for you right now on your screen.